Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our project presentation on evaluating and improving labor forecast accuracy for advanced auto parts. Let's start by introducing our team.
Hey everyone, my name is Colin O'Reilly. I graduated from Virginia Tech last year with a degree in finance with a concentration in accounting.
I am Pranya Surkutwar. I have majored in engineering and management. I have worked over 8 years in human resources and project management roles.
Bryson Ford. I graduated Virginia Tech with an undergraduate degree in business information technology with a specialization in cybersecurity management and analytics.
We would like to extend our heartfelt appreciation to Advanced Auto Part team, Chuck, Roger, Nathan, Samantha, and also our CBA advisor, Dr. Patticelli, for their unwavering guidance and support throughout this project. To introduce Advanced Auto Parts, actually, I don't think so. Advanced Auto Parts needs any introduction, but Advanced Auto Parts is a leading automotive parts provider in the USA, Canada, Puerto Rico, and US Virgin Islands. Now to introduce our project. Everybody in today's world understands the importance of forecasting, and businesses heavily rely on forecasting for predicting future values using the past data. Advanced Auto Part realizes the importance of forecasting very well. Even though they are doing their great job in labor forecasting, they still find the need of improvement and they feel there is a need of continuous improvement. So our project statement was to develop more accurate, reusable forecasting model, which can be used in a labor allocation. So this would be helping them in improving labor allocation and achieving the higher profit margin. Our main team objective was to reduce the mean absolute percentage error, that is MAPE. Kunal will talk in detail in the later slides about MAPE. We were provided with do-it-yourself and professional transaction data. That is DIY is when customers walks into the stores and purchases off the shelf. And pro transactions happen when professional stores and garages reaches to Advanced Auto Parts. So after developing a suitable model, we estimated the profit and loss impact of a more accurate labor forecasting model. Now I pass it over to Kunal to talk more about forecasting.
Thank you, Pranya. So the type of forecasting our team conducted was time series forecasting. Time series forecasting is when you predict future values based on patterns and trends you see in historical data. Data for time series forecasting must be collected at regular intervals, such as daily, weekly, or monthly. For our project, data was collected at the daily intervals. So below, we can see an example forecast for one store's DIY transaction. The black dots represent historical data seen in the stores from June to August of 2022. We can see a red line going through those data points, which is the forecast picking up on any patterns or trends it sees in the data. And to the right of the blue line, we can see that forecast continue with what it believes will happen in the future. We can see a larger red band, which represents the forecast interval, which shows the actual range that future values are most likely to fall in. So with any forecasting method, there's various ways to evaluate the performance. Our team chose to focus on mean absolute percentage error, or MAPE. MAPE calculates how accurate your forecasted transactions were in comparison to the actual transactions seen on that day. So for example, for one period, if we forecasted 79 transactions, however, 76 transactions actually occurred, if we take the absolute value of the difference and plug all these values into that formula above, we'll get an absolute percentage error value of around 4% for this period. So now, if we were to do this for a few more periods, we'll have multiple absolute percentage error values that when we take the average or the mean, we can get the mean absolute percentage error. We did this for every store and every instance that we forecasted for in our project. So we provided daily store transaction data from over 4,500 stores across the United States. After talking with the Advanced Auto Parts team, we narrowed that scope down to around 2,500 non-minimum coverage stores. Minimum coverage stores are stores that, regardless of any change in forecasted demand, they will have a set number of employees at that store regardless, so we chose to omit those from our analysis. Still, these around 2,500 stores left us with over 670,000 transaction data points to use in our analysis, just from the years 2022 and 2023. We focused on these 2 years to omit any effect that COVID may have on any past data trends. Now I'm going to pass it on to Bryson, who's going to talk a little bit more about our forecasting model selection.
Thank you, Kunal. So after the data exploration phase, we wanted to look and see what Advanced Auto Parts was using for their current model, which is a specialized type of moving average model. It produced a MAPE of around 12.7%, and we wanted to use that as a benchmark for the models that we had created and tested. So to begin, we started out with a Holt-Winters model, which uses exponential smoothing along with seasonality components to forecast values. It produced a MAPE of around 23.1%. Next, which when compared to the current model was not really where we wanted to be, so we moved on to an ARIMA model, or an autoregressive integrated moving average model. And to capture that seasonality component within the data, we used an SARIMA as well. And this produced a slightly better MAPE with around 18.4%, but still really wasn't where we wanted to be when compared to the current model. Finally, we came to JUMP, or JMP, which is a statistical analytics tool developed by SAS. It has a multitude of machine learning and forecasting capabilities. And one of these capabilities includes creating a tailored model for each store based on the trends within that data. So the new JUMP models produced a MAPE of around 12.5%, which is much more comparable to the current model that AAT was already using. But even though we were producing a comparable MAPE, we still wanted to drive that down even more. So we decided to compare the forecast when compared to actuals. This is just theoretical DIY transaction data for a theoretical store. So at first we decided to map out the current model, which we noticed had a tendency to over forecast when compared to the actuals. And next we mapped out the new JUMP tailored models, which had a tendency to under forecast when compared to actuals. So we decided to combine the benefits of both models by creating a new hybrid model, which is taking the average of the forecast from both the current model and the JUMP models to create a new model, which brought us much closer to the actuals and reduced our MAPE by about 2% to bring us down to about 10% MAPE overall for both DIY and pro transaction. So next, I will pass it off to Colin O'Reilly to talk about the model comparisons.
Thank you, Bryson. So just to show what that forecasting performance improvement looked like, we'll compare Advance's current model to the hybrid model, the MAPE between those two. So on the DIY side, we can see a MAPE improvement from 12.7% to 10%. And similarly, on the pro side, we can see a MAPE improvement from 13% to 10.4%. So this was a pretty significant improvement from what we've seen thus far in our analysis. And after we did some economic analysis, we calculated that the annual savings from this forecasting improvement across all stores would result in around $7.5 million in annual savings. So from our research, our team found that more accurate transaction forecasts would assist stores in making sure that they are better properly allocating labor to meet the expected demand that they are likely to see on a daily basis in these stores, as well as make sure that they're not spending unnecessary amounts of money on excess labor costs. We also found that the hybrid model that our team created showed a significant improvement in MAPE for both DIY and pro transaction forecast. We also found that improved labor allocation not only increases profitability for stores, but also increases overall customer satisfaction through reduced wait times, as well as better customer associate interaction. So thank you all for taking the time to listen to us explain to you a little bit about the capstone project that we've spent the past year working on. We're grateful to have had experience working on a real world project instead of something that's just hypothetical that most programs typically give you. We're also grateful to have worked in the same team for the entire year. Most group projects are typically, maybe a few weeks, maybe a semester max, but we got to know each other pretty well over the past year. So it was a great experience. We'd like to turn it over to the audience now for any questions you all may have at this time.
So with the jump models, it's not something that we can so in one of our deliverables, we're going to leave a step-by-step guide on how they can replicate the models for the future.
Thank you very much.